welcome back to Feather Stitch House. My name's Rebecca, and each week on this channel I upload videos about embroidery and textile art to help you get creative. Each year we create a project called Winging It, and these are improvised pieces that I make on camera to help take some of the fear away from experimenting with your textiles and thread. This year we're making a fabric journal, and each month, week by week, we're building a picture in textiles and thread that reflects the world around us and what's happening in our lives. So this month we've been creating a threshold to symbolise a transition point in our lives, and we've built our door, we've set it in a wall, and last week we added some signs of life around that door to give a suggestion of what might be beyond. Now, right from the start, I've said that I'm going to create a meadow scene behind my door, and in ancient stories, meadows were symbols of places of fruitfulness and regeneration, and that is really what I'm hoping for this next stage of my life. So you need to have a think before you start stitching about what scene is going to best reflect what you are hoping for this next stage. Maybe it's a meadow like me, maybe it's something different, and I will offer some suggestions along the way. So grab some threads and a needle and your panel, and let's get stitching. Right, so this is where we got up to, and I brought my aperture in just so that you can get a sense of what our door is looking like so far. I have seen some absolutely gorgeous doors on our Facebook group, so if you're not sure about the Facebook group, the details are in the description below. You can also post on Instagram if you're making along. Just use hashtag FSH Winging It 24, and that'll gather together all of the Winging It pieces from this year's stitch along. So it's a bit of housekeeping out of the way. So what we've got to do today is our meadow. So we've got our void behind the door at the moment, and we want to bring some life into that. So I've got some scraps of fabric here, and I thought we would do some turned edge applique to create this background, and I'm going to layer up some fabrics that get progressively paler. So I want to create a little bit of perspective, and I'm going to lay it on, making sure there's a little bit of overhang. And this is where you get your fingers in, because we're going to use the shape to get our guidelines in place. So I'm going to just use my pen to feel the way around the outside of the door frame. You could bring back your door template and use that, but I want this to be as near to the right shape as I can get it. Okay, so that's the top, and I'm not worried about that chunk that's missing. I want less sky than meadow, but I don't want it to be a straight line. So we're going to play around with that, pop that in my scraps box, and I'm going to cut around with maybe 1/4 inch, 1/2 centimetre border, and I'm going to put a couple of little snips, and I want to start at the top of the door, and what I'm going to do is just finger press that back, tuck it in as close to my bricks as I can manage, and I'm going to pin right at the end. This is just a starting point for us. So I'm going to fold that back to the line, tuck it into the edge of my brick, and catch it with a pin. And then I've just got some ordinary machine thread, and I'm going to applique stitch this down. So put my needle through just inside that shape at the fold. I've just knotted the end and I'm pulling through. And now I'm going to go down just through the backing fabric. Slide my needle along and come up a little further along my shape through the blue fabric. This is me creating my sky. So hop over so that I'm going down just through the backing fabric, slide my needle along and up through the blue. And this is going to put some teeny tiny little stitches in. So as soon as I've gone up to where the pin is, I can move the pin out of the way and just hook my needle underneath to move the fabric back a little bit so that it's matching up with the brick. So I wanted to stitch the meadow last. We'll talk a bit more about this as I go through the video, but I didn't want the meadow to come before the threshold, if that makes sense, because you have to cross through, you have to get past the wall, go through the door before you get to what's beyond. So this piece is telling a story, even in the way that we're constructing it. Now, you don't have to do a meadow. You might be completely confused by what's on the other side of your threshold. So you might want to do forest. You might be going into something you've worked at for years and now you're just stepping through to the point where you can enjoy it. So you might want something like a garden or something that's more cultivated. Maybe you're stepping into some hard work, so you might want to put a farm, perhaps, something like that. Maybe you are totally unknown. Maybe your situation is going to be totally unknown and you might want a bit of a wild space. Or maybe you feel like you've come to an end point, so you might want to put a coastline, something like that. So you need to think about whatever is the other side of your threshold that you're stepping through into and create a scene accordingly. But you can create it in very similar ways to the methods I'm going to show you. So we're going to do lots of florals today with our stitching, but we're going to create our background first. So you can see that is lining up really nicely with the edges of the bricks. Thank you again for all your comments and your engagement with these videos. It's really heartwarming. I think I've said it before, making videos for YouTube has the potential to be quite a lonely thing because I'm essentially talking to myself here in my room. I've just plugged in my mic and I'm stitching in a room on my own. There's nobody else in the house. Everybody's at school or work. My son's away at university. I'm just sitting here on my own, chuntering away. And it could feel very lonely. You just make your things and you put them out into the ether and just hope for the best. But actually, I never feel like I'm talking to myself, not ever, because I know there are just so many wonderful humans out there, mostly women, who faithfully watch each week, always say hi in the comments, and I know that I am actually talking to people who are going to listen and respond. So even though the conversation's a little bit more protracted because there's gaps between what I'm saying and what you say back, the effect still is the same. It still feels like a conversation, and I love that. I really love it. So whether you are brand new here or you've been around since the very beginning, you might have done all of the Winging It projects, you might never have done any, you might have just watched the videos, this might be the first time you're joining in, or you might have only just found my channel last week. I am so grateful for you all. I really am. And there wouldn't be this meadow if it wasn't for you. So I am so grateful that you're here. Okay, so that's my sky. That's going to show through. So whatever I stitch into the sky is going to show through. And just to help me with that, I'm going to draw around that space inside my door window, that little opening that I put. So that will give me a bit of an idea of what will be visible on the front. Now, if you look at a landscape, what you should see is that things get paler as they get further away. And so what we want to do is find a fabric that is quite pale. We want a mid-tone fabric, and we want a darker fabric. So things are going to get paler into the distance. So our darker fabric is going to go at the bottom, and mid-tone is going to go halfway up, and then our palest colour is going to go against the sky. So that's what we're going to start with. And I don't want this to be just flat. I want to create a bit of a roll in our meadow. So I'm just going to draw a line just to guide me, and then I'm going to, like I did before, trim that back. And it's not too much of a curve, so I'm not going to worry about snipping this time. I'm going to cut that rough edge off and come down in that direction. So this is my starting point, and I'm going to start into my sky because I want some of this to show through. I can now be certain that I'm going to see some of my meadow through the back. So I'm going to pin this in place with a couple of applique pins, and I just need to remember that will also have to turn under the sides. So I need those sides to come under and tuck up against the bricks around the door like that, and I need to do that on both sides. I'm not going to worry about that right now because I just want to show you the kind of effect that we're going to create. A lot of this is going to be covered up, so you don't really need to worry too much because we're going to overstitch this. So that is the background for my meadow, and when all that is turned back, we can have a lovely fading landscape with depth going back into the distance. So I'm going to stitch all that down using my applique stitch like I just did, and then we'll come back and see how it's looking. So here we go. This is where we're up to so far. I've closed my door again. You can see I've got a little bit of my green fabric poking out of the top there, and when I open my door, here is my meadow, and already I think you can see that there's some depth going back into the background. So I've drawn around my art just so that I know what's going to show and what isn't, and I really like the way these edges have worked. So this one was a little bit tricky, and what I did in the end was I just made sure that I didn't stitch right up to the edge on each of my horizontals. So stop just shy of the edge, and I did all of that side in one go, and I just folded the door right back and stitched right up from bottom to top. So that's where we're up to. Now you could, if you wanted to, leave it there. You've got your meadow, particularly if you've used florals. You could go back to a technique that we did back in February where we printed words onto little strips of fabric and put them on, so you could put in your intentions for whatever it is you're stepping into. You could sew on some little buttons and beads and turn those into flowers. I'm going to do some embroidery on mine, so you can decide, depending on where you're up to and how much time you have, you can totally decide what you're going to do at this point. Okay, so we're going to first of all lay a layer of grass, and I'm starting with the grass that's furthest away. So this is meadow grass, and I've got a single strand here of embroidery thread, and what we're going to do is just make some straight stitches, and it'll help with this looking a little bit more organic if some of your stitches go off the edge, and we want to keep these really small. Now you can be as sort of dense or as light-handed with this as you like. It's entirely up to you, but just like when we were doing the grass, we don't want all of them starting and finishing in the same places. So I've just got a light green here to start off with, and I'm just going to stitch over this space, just adding in some straight stitches that look a little bit like grass, and we're basically going to expand this down into our doorway. So we're going to keep our stitches quite small while they're up here, have an occasional longer stitch, that's fine, but we're just trying to add some texture. So down here we're going to make our stitches a little bit longer, and when we get to the foreground we're going to be stitching with more strands and then maybe some much longer stitches. What's really important is that you don't create lines. We're obviously helped by our fabric because that's already got some colours on it, but we're just going to sort of quilt these layers together and create a bit of texture. Okay, so I've put in some grasses and I've gone in as well with a mid-tone green just to make it a little bit more thorough. And now I've got 2 strands of red thread, and we're going to put in some flowers. So at this distance they are just going to look like specks. So you could, if you wanted to, just do a tiny straight stitch and a mean tiny, like that kind of size. I'm going to do some single wrapped French knots. So I've just got 2 strands and I'm wrapping once around my needle, and I'm going to place these just randomly all over the meadow. You don't want this to be too even, so you might want to have some in a little cluster, some very close together, and leave a little gap, put another one in, and you can just work your way around the space, go right down to the next layer. Just want to create the illusion that these are growing over the hill. If you're not sure about French knots, we did go through them in detail last week, and I also have a whole playlist of stitch tutorials that I will link at the top of the screen so that you can go and check those out. But just as a little tip, the trick with French knots is to keep tension on your working thread the whole time. And this is going to be a lovely one for some just mindful stitching, lots of repetitive stitch. It's going to be lovely to do while you're listening to an audio book or sitting in the garden if it's sunny, or wherever you like to stitch, just to relax. So we're trying to create this sense of distant flowers in this layer, and then as we get further forward we're going to make our flowers a little bit bigger and more defined. So I'm just going to show you how to do this field in the distance, and then I'll show you the field at the front and how to make the flowers a little bit more defined. We've obviously already got some flowers on from the fabric, but we'll work on that shortly. Okay, so this is my top meadow. If I bring it up close, hopefully you can see that. So I've got all my little straight stitches, and I've done a whole bunch of French knots in red, yellow, blue. I've put some pink here and there, and then I might have to get this even closer for you to be able to see. I've put in some tiny bullion knots in purple, so I've only wrapped these 5 times. I will show you how to do these. So that is my meadow that's furthest away. What we're trying to do is create the illusion of lots of flowers and lots of life, and so that's my furthest away meadow, and I'm going to just repeat that on these 2 sections, but making my flowers a little bit more distinct, so the knots will be bigger, and by the time I get to here I might be doing some other stitches as well. But I thought what I could do on this space is show you how I'm going to do the foreground design. So going to start with 2 strands of my mid green, and I'm just going to knot the end, and then we're going to put in some grasses first of all. So just in this thread I'm going to show you a couple of ways that you can add some grasses. One that I'm going to do is going to be a almost like I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this actually, almost like a bulrush kind of seed head. So I'm going to start by doing a small chain stitch at the top there. So I've come out, gone round, gone back in where my thread originally came up, and coming out, making sure my thread is passing over, my needle is passing over that loop of thread. That puts a little chain stitch in my fabric there, and then I'm just going to do a long stem like that. And if you want to, if it's very long, you can come up halfway along and just put a little couching stitch over the top of that stem to hold it in place. So this is similar to the way that we did our foliage back in January when we were adding some foreground sort of seed heads and things like this. But suddenly when you do it in green, you end up with a grass that's gone to seed rather than a seed head. And there are loads of lovely grasses. So that's one grass that you can put in. Another one is that you can make a long chain stitch. So this time we're going to start from lower down. I don't want them all to start at the bottom line. So this time I'm going to work my chain stitch from bottom to top like that, and I'm going to pull it so that it's very long and thin there. And then I'm going to hop over and put a little anchoring stitch in there. This is going to be like a thicker grass blade. Then I'm going to come back up inside the loop, and I want to make my grass look like it's folding over. And so I'm going to just put in a stitch that is angled out to the side like that. And these don't look very much when you're doing them individually, but once you've put in lots of different colours, and I can go back in, put straight stitch down the middle there. We've got a sort of grass blade there. I've just pulled a little bit of the batting through. That's another one. You can also do just straight stitches like we've done before. So just put in the odd straight stitch here and there. Just making sure they're worked at different angles, and the further you go back in your field, the smaller they should be. And that's going to help with creating some depth. So you can just work your way backwards and forwards like that. And again, we want some that are going to overlap the top of that sort of patch of meadow. So I've got my straight stitches working their way up there like that. You need to make sure that you're not pulling too tight with these. Any looped stitches have the potential to pull in your panel and make your tension go a little bit awry. So you just want to make sure that that's not happening either. So you can also do a sort of offset fly stitch. So I'm creating a straight line with a little bit going off to the side. So rather than making my fly stitch horizontal, I'm going to come down diagonally, almost create a little triangle like that, come back. So I'm laying the stem where I want it to go, coming down diagonally from the top of that stem, rocking my needle back to where the thread is, pulling through, and then I can take the stem down in whatever direction I want to. And you could put a little granito or something like that in there, and you can work that the other way around as well. So this time I'm going to go up beyond and pull through, and that makes a nice little stem for you to place a flower in. I think we're obviously not going to do photorealistic flowers. I'm just giving you a kind of graphic way that you can use stitches to create an illusion of a flower. So a good one is a blanket stitch wheel for this. So I've brought my thread through, and we're going to create our horizontal line worked in a circle around the middle, but we want our spokes to come out. So we're coming up at the centre. You can draw a little circle if it helps. We're going to come out from that and rock our needle back and come up just to the side of where our thread came through, and then we're going to work our way around a little bit more. So normally with a blanket stitch we're working on squares. I suppose we're working on triangles with this one, creating angled stitches that all come to the centre. I don't think my first stitch was quite big enough, so I'm just going to put another one in there in the gap, and then we go back down at the centre, just making sure we've hopped over the loop, and we get this little almost spiral floral spray that looks really cute. So for a poppy we want our stitches springing from a central point, so we're going to make little chain stitches like this, and this is very similar to how we did the leaves, because we don't want holes. So I'm going to put a straight stitch down the centre of that, and I'm going to do 3 stitches like that. Make sure you don't pull your loops too tight, because they'll close back in on themselves and you'll end up with very straight leaves rather than rounded ones. We do our 3 like that, and then I'm going to come and put a couple more petals in the gaps like this. So these will make bigger, more sort of robust flowers for your foreground, and that's going to help create that sense of depth, because the colours that you've hinted at here are going to appear more. And really this is, you know, you can do whatever you like. You can make whatever flowers you like. You can do them all as lazy daisies if you want to, but we want a nice kind of lousy poppy that can appear in the foreground like that. So if you put a green stem on that, you'd have something approximating a poppy. I've probably made my anchor stitches a little bit too long, so the petals look a bit pointier than they ought to. So another one that you can do is like almost like an echinacea flower. This time you want your petals to come down, and what we're going to do is create a centre that goes up like that, and we're going to create some some detached chain stitches that come down like that. So our poppy is basically built like that. And then we're going to have like an echinacea flower. You can obviously put a simple daisy in. You put a yellow French knot at the centre, quite a big one, and do some petals around the outside. You can also do some lavender, and there's lots of ways of doing that. You can either make a stem and then put French knots like that, or you can do it with a bullion knot. So let's show you the echinacea first of all. I've got some pink here, and I want to sit I'm just going to turn it upside down because it's easier for me to form the stitches. So I'm going to put my detached chain stitches, quite long thin ones like that. That one can go there. And then we're going to move along a little bit and put another one next to it. And again, if you want to, you can put a straight stitch down the centre of these if you want to, just to fill in the petals. Like that. And then the centre you can either do with French knots, or you could do a little satin stitch centre. So I quite like French knots for the centre of these. And you'd only need a couple of flowers of this size, and then you can build the rest with your French knots, just like we did on the higher meadow. You just maybe do your French knots with 6 strands when you're right at the front, just to give the illusion of lots more flowers. That's my little echinacea plant, maybe a different shade of green. And I just want to show you the bullion knot if you want to use it for lavender. I think it adds beautiful texture, but I do know that this is a very divisive stitch, and what I'm looking for, a milliner's needle. So this is a milliner's needle. Milliner's needles are the same thickness all the way through, so the eye isn't any thicker than the shaft of the needle, and that's really important because we're going to wrap the needle in thread, and then we're going to pull the needle through those wraps. So these are tricky. Some people love them, some people hate them, some people think they just look like caterpillars. So what we do is we come up at the top of where we want our knot to be, and we go back down at the bottom of where we want our knot to be, and then we rock our needle forward back to the top like that. And we're going to not pull through, we're going to leave the needle in the fabric, and I'm going to tip it forward with my non-dominant hand. So this is all about making two hands work together. It is a two-handed stitch, this. You do need both hands. So I've got my thread coming out here, going back in here, and it will ultimately come back out here, but at the moment it's attached to my needle, which is sitting in the fabric. I'm going to lift up the tip of my needle with my non-dominant hand and get my working thread with my dominant hand. So for me that's my right, and I'm going to wrap the thread around the needle. And I want to wrap it as many times as it takes, and you have to kind of eyeball this to create the same distance as you've got fabric caught on the needle. So I've got about 1 centimetre's worth of fabric there, and now I've got about 1 centimetre's worth of wraps on my needle, and these will bunch up a little bit when we pull through. So now I've wrapped it, I want them nice and taut around the needle, not super tight but not loopy either, and I'm just going to pinch those wraps in my left hand, my non-dominant hand, and then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to pull it through those wraps. So with a milliner's needle that comes out quite freely. If you have any problems, I'll show you what to do in a second. So what happens when you pull through is that set of wraps gets pulled back on itself and it lies down over the distance of fabric that you caught in your needle. So now my working thread is back at the bottom, and I'm just going to take my needle through at the bottom of my stitch, and that's a little bullion knot that just sits on the surface. So let me show you that again. So I'm going to come up through the fabric at the top of where I want my knot. I'm going to go back down through the fabric at the bottom of where I want my knot and rock my needle forward so that it comes out at the top of my knot where that thread came through the fabric in the first place. I'm going to tip my needle forward, and then I'm going to wrap the thread around the needle until the space that the wraps cover, gone a few too many times there I think, is the same as the space of fabric that's on the needle. Pinch the wraps, and if they're too tight and the needle's not coming through, if you just roll those wraps backwards and forwards as you pull the needle through, the needle will come off. You just roll them between your finger and thumb. So they were sitting upright like that, and as I pull through they tip back on themselves and sit on the fabric, and you can just use your thumbnail, you can just roll them a little bit, use your thumb or the needle if you don't have any nails, if you're a biter. You can just use the needle to push those wraps back up, take your needle back through the fabric, and there you've got a little bullion knot. So that's a bunch of flowers, literally. This one we did this back in March. I think we did it in March. So this one we make all our detached chains spring from the centre, and we work them round in a circle, and then we can put a French knot at the centre. There are loads of ways of making flowers, so you can just play away, enjoy yourself, do whatever works for you. We did granitos last week. Some granitos might look nice as well. You could do some cornflowers, you could do some cow parsley, whatever says meadow to you, you can just go for it. So I'm actually going to start by putting some flowers in. That's going to be my starting point, and then I'm going to build the grasses around them. So I'm going to do that, and I just wanted to tell you a little story while I was working, because working on this piece, just pinning my door out of the way again, has been really kind of cathartic for me, and I've been thinking about the doorway that I'm going through. And it's funny, after I told you all about it, I actually really struggled the following week, and I think sometimes that happens, doesn't it, when you go public with something and put it out there in the world, it gets challenged and tested. Something shifts it, and the prospect of the step that you're making actually becomes really challenging. And I found myself just thinking, this is supposed to be a meadow, this is supposed to be a place of regeneration and flourishing and fruitfulness. And I just feel tired and sluggish, and everything just feels too hard. And I was thinking about that and remembered an experience I had when I was in my 20s, I suppose. I was part of a community group, and we were trying to do some good. We were trying to do some community work, and a member of the group found this organisation. They basically put you in touch with people who had gardens that they could no longer manage, and you would go round to their house and mow their lawn or trim their hedge, or do a bit of weeding or whatever, and just help them keep their green space. So we got paired with this woman who did not have a straightforward garden at all. And we were very young, completely out of our depth. But we went to this house in Cambridge, and the garden was enormous. It was absolutely vast. And she was gardening in a very unusual way. And basically, she'd created spaces in her garden that had formed little mini ecosystems. So she got a wetland area that had a pond, and she'd allowed wetland plants to grow, and she'd allowed the pond to just kind of form naturally by itself. She'd put it in shade, and she'd allowed creatures to just find the pond and make it their home there. And so she'd had quite endangered species. She got newts and toads and all sorts of things living in her pond. She had a little woodland space, and she'd allowed a woodland ecosystem to just develop. So she got fungi growing there and English bluebells. So she got all these different sort of mini ecosystems in her garden, and we just didn't have a clue what we were doing. We were just trying not to do any damage. So she asked us to clear some weeds, and we couldn't tell what were weeds and what were rare species of plant and things like that, and it was just difficult. She was just keeping a watchful eye, giving us a bit of a steer. I think we're all kind of hoping for the best. But the thing that came to mind for me was the centre of her garden. She did not mow. She had just left it, and she'd left it for about 10 years, actually. And she'd been gardening this way for about a decade, I think. And she had just allowed nature to take its course, and the idea that she'd started with was that if she just left it, it would become a meadow. It would turn back into kind of an ancient meadow. And she had waited for years for something good to happen in this space in the middle of her garden. So she just not mowed it, she just totally left it. So the grass was sort of almost waist deep, and I remember her telling us a little bit about the process, that they just had to be brave. And she'd started this with her husband, who had passed away, and they just had to be brave and just keep going with the belief that this would happen naturally. And so they didn't live in the middle of nowhere. They had neighbours who had just watched their garden become wilder and wilder and more unruly and just kind of scary looking. It just looked really unkempt, and there were nettles and all sorts started growing in what had once been their beautifully manicured lawn. She didn't want to do too much because she was trying to attract pollinators first and foremost, but she was also waiting to see what nature did. And she had just that year, so about 10 years into her experiment, had been going exploring the meadow just to keep a check on what had emerged. And she had discovered a really rare orchid that had grown, it's really endangered in the UK. I can't remember what it was, which orchid it was, but it was really rare, and it had found its way into her meadow. One of the reasons why it's so endangered is that we don't have many meadows left in the UK. There are not many spaces that are not cultivated, so the majority of the UK is farmland, and certainly Lincolnshire, where I live, is nearly all farmland. And she'd just had to wait in faith and trust that one day this would work, and she'd watched her garden just become awful and had to exercise, I suppose, something like faith that her meadow would come, and it had. So we were there at the wrong time of year. We didn't see it in all its finery, but in the summer she would have dozens of species of grass and wildflower and plants. She'd have hundreds and hundreds of species of pollinators coming in and making use of her little meadow in the middle of her lawn. She'd got all sorts of flowering plants, and it worked, but she'd had to wait a long time for that to work. And so what it made me realise while I was feeling really frustrated, that literally the week after I'd talked about how excited I was about stepping into my meadow, it felt like my meadow had just been mowed and and destroyed, and I just couldn't get anything done, and it's just one thing after another robbing me of time and making that meadow feel very far away. And this story came to mind, and it just made me think about how sometimes we have to fight for our meadow. Our meadows sometimes come as almost like a leap of faith. They come by just trusting that it will work. And that's not to say that we just sit back and are fatalistic and are totally, que sera, and just wait for things to drop into our laps. Obviously, we do the things that we need to do to make life work and give ourselves the best possible shot at success. But sometimes you have to really fight. So that I think this panel works in lots of different ways. We have to choose to go through our threshold moments. Sometimes we have to climb or leap or struggle over the wall that's blocking us. Sometimes that threshold is not obvious and it's locked, and it takes a lot of effort to get through. Sometimes we have to break the wall down to get to the garden or the meadow on the other side. And sometimes it's just a bit of a leap of faith, isn't it? And we just go for it and just trust our instincts, trust our gut, and find success on the other side. But I just kind of want to acknowledge the struggle, really, the struggle for the meadow. It's not easy, and I think we have to just keep cheering each other on, don't we? That's why I've been so touched by so many of your comments that are just so hugely encouraging, and I love the the power that it has when women support each other and cheer each other on and don't try and compete. You know, there's room enough for us all on this platform, in this world. There's room enough for everybody. And so I think if I have a bit of meadow to spare, come and sit in it with me. I think that's what these videos are all about. This is me inviting you to stitch along and just enjoy the flowers that are growing all around us, enjoy the fruitfulness, enjoy the inspiration. I'm kind of talking metaphorically, and maybe this won't make sense, but if it does, then great. So there we go. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, as they say. None of us really know what we're doing, do we? We're just all muddling through. So I hope you're getting the idea of what I'm doing here. I'm just scattering my colours around, just creating some floral forms. And I'm trying really hard not to make everything sit in a line. So these poppies are a bit even for my liking. It's actually just really straightforward, simple stitches combined to create some just simple floral forms. And then towards the back of this I can add in some knots, and another way that you can add texture is normally with a French knot we keep everything tight, but if you don't, so if I don't hold on to that thread, or just make sure it's out of the way but don't keep it under tension, so I haven't got my wraps down to the fabric and I haven't kept tension, I get a really loopy knot, and that's going to add a little bit of size to my flower heads. It actually looks a little bit rose-like. You wouldn't really get roses growing in a meadow. Well, you might get like briar roses, wild roses, but I'm just putting in some really loopy, loose French knots here and there, and they are going to give a sense of flowers a bit further away, not quite in the foreground, but that are still much chunkier than these. So I hope you've got some ideas there of how to create some floral forms and how to create some depth. So this middle ground, all my knots and stitches are going to be a bit chunkier to create depth, and I'm just going to keep working on this until I'm happy that it's pretty full. I want it to be vibrant and looking like there's lots of life here. The other thing I am going to do, this bit sort of plain, the sky, so I might just use some seed stitch to create some cloud forms, just in a pale grey or a white. Just want to create a sense that something else is going on in the sky, but I'm also going to put some birds in, really simply, and I want to put them inside that archway that's drawn on, because I want them to show through the door, and it's really simple. So we're just going to do a really wide fly stitch. So I've come out there, I'm going in here, and I'm coming out in the middle, but I'm keeping it very shallow, like that, hopping over to catch that in place. And as long as you make sure that they're not all quite at the same angle, you can even do one pointing up, because birds don't, in the flying formation, they don't always flap at the same time as each other. Hop over here and do a couple of really small ones. They're going to again give the illusion of depth. These look like they're further away. Like that. So just a couple of birds in the sky, just to give a sense that life is there. And so when I close my door, just untuck that, I'm going to have a little bit of meadow and some birds and maybe some wisps of cloud showing through. So I'm just going to stitch that. I'm just going to stitch that off camera now, and then I will come back and show you the finished stitching, and then we'll just put some beads and a couple of pebbles. I've got these lovely, I'll show you the pebbles. I just thought, I love the texture of them, and I thought this would make a great sort of pebbly edge to my path, or could just put a little pile of stones here and there, something like that. That just adds a little bit of texture. So I'm going to go away and do a bit of stitching, and then we'll come back and I'll show you our finished panel. Okay, so here is my finished panel. You can see I've put some binding around the edge, just like we have with all our panels. This was actually slightly stretchy fabric, so I made life a bit difficult for myself, but it is a fabric that appears somewhere around, around the edge on the brickwork, so I thought it picked up the colours really nicely. I've also found a little, this is actually a clasp, it's a necklace clasp that I found in my bead box and have attached it as the sort of latch of the gate. I think that's really cute. And I put in some beads down at the bottom. Let me bring it up a little bit so you can see it a bit better. So these are those textured beads, and I found some little sort of neutral toned stone beads as well, so pop some of those in. That's the little clasp. It's really cute. It's just got this little ring at the top for a jump ring to go through, and I liked the leaves. I thought it echoed what was going on around the panel. You can also see there that I put in some clouds. I will open the door in a minute, and I used a bit of seed stitch to kind of fade sky down towards the horizon. So these are just straight stitches that have created clouds. So I just love the way this looks. I'm so happy with it. And if I open the door, that is my meadow, and what a joy it is. I think, I know I say this every month, but I do think this is my favourite panel. So you can see that just changing the sizes of the French knots. I've got this detail in the front. I'll bring it up to the camera in a second. I've got this detail in the front where we've actually formed those flowers, but by changing the size of the knot as it works its way back to the horizon, you just get this sense of distance, and that really busy fabric no longer really matters. It just adds a bit of depth and a bit of clarity of colour. So if I bring it up, there you go. Hopefully you can see there some of the stitches. So down here I've done some kind of cow parsley with some French knots and just some stems there. I did these little fly stitch flowers, made my poppies like I showed you, my echinacea, and I put some little daisies in. I haven't worried about a centre for those. But I think they just, I find the way they are. And then I've got my little bullion knot lavender and my cornflowers, and then my really loose loopy knots. That one's very loopy there. And they just work their way back to tiny knots. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this was quick. It really wasn't. This has been hours of stitching, but it's been such a mindful project because it's quite repetitive. I've been able to just stitch away mindfully, put on an audio book, just lost in my thoughts, thinking about what the meadow meant to me, and it has just been an absolute joy. So you can be far less detailed than this. I know I'm often criticised in the comments for creating pieces that are overstitched, they're too busy. I don't care. If I'm allowed to say that. I think it's an issue of style, and I really like spaces in my work that are really densely stitched. So we've got lots of space, there's hardly any stitching on the front, and then we've just got this little field of abundance behind the door that makes me really happy. I love the fact that it peeks through. You get a little glimpse of it behind the door, just enough to entice you to open it. Now you could put a button or a little popper if you want to keep your door closed. I want it to just be able to swing open. So I'm just gonna leave it like that. So that's our finished piece, and I have really enjoyed this month. I hope you have too. I'm so pleased with the outcome, and I love the fact that this, in a really subtle way, captures a really significant moment in my life that happened kind of early May. And I will never be able to look at this piece neutrally because it actually means so much to me. So I hope that your door panel has meant as much to you. Can't wait to see what you put behind your doors. I hope you enjoy stitching yours. If you want another landscape inspired piece, I will put a video here, and if you're not sure about these stitches, I do have a playlist down here that will take you through all of the stitches that you might want to use. So go and check these videos out next if you want to carry on with your project. Have a great week, and I will see you very soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.